Well, welcome everyone. This is exciting, isn't it? To join together through this venue called Zoom for this introductory session that will help us, I hope, learn the Bible in the context of the land of Israel. So we welcome you, everyone. My name is Pastor John DeLancey. I serve as the director of Biblical Israel Ministries and Tours. Basically, we do two things. We lead rock-solid trips to Israel, and we teach the Bible in the context of this particular land we call Israel. I'm going to refer to it tonight as the playing board of the Bible. So we welcome you wherever you are joining us. We are thrilled. I know we have a few people overseas, and I think it's probably 12 or 13-hour difference. So we are so thrilled to have you as well, people from all over the country and really the world. So welcome to this session on bringing the Bible to life. Literally and technically, our title is Biblical Israel Learning the Playing Board of the Bible. So let me open in prayer, and then I'll share a couple words of sort of not instruction, but a couple words of introduction of how we are going to proceed with this first session. And then I'll share my screen so that you can see what I have prepared for us tonight. So if I may, I'd be honored to lead us in prayer. Lord, thank you for this opportunity to be together. It's exciting to meet and learn together online here about the land where many of the stories of the Bible took place. So I thank you personally for everyone joining us tonight and also watching this on a recorded video later. We are just so thrilled that you have helped us arrange this. And we just pray for your guidance and for your insights that we might not only be excited about learning about the Bible in the context of the land, but also help us to grow in our faith together. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So let me share a couple of things, and I'm going to, in the meantime, begin to share my screen with you. And also let me say that I have muted all of you, which means that I can't hear you at this point, and I hope that you can only hear me. We do that because it's much easier to listen to the presentation without some background noise from other microphones that are picked up, of course, throughout this presentation. So right now, you're all muted, and I hope you don't take offense to that, but this is the best way to present what we have tonight. Also, I want to say, additionally, as I now share my screen with you, and you should be able to see my presentation that looks like this. This is the introductory slide, if you will, of our presentation tonight. I hope I'm in the right part of the screen for you, maybe up in the right top corner. So if that's the case, that's great. That's where you should be able to see me as we begin this session. So I'm assuming that you're seeing my screen, and we'll proceed together. But one other thing I want to mention is that I have a few drone videos in this presentation. It's probably about 55 minutes long, and I'm hoping that you're able to hang in here for the whole time with us. But the drone videos, because of the I guess the speed of the stream online, they will appear choppy. In fact, my voice won't even correspond probably to what you're going to see on the videos. So just keep that in mind. It's nothing on my end. It's nothing on your end, but that's sort of the limitations of doing and showing video online like this over this platform that is called Zoom. So, and third and last, before we begin this session, is that if you have a question, what we're going to do is at the very end, I don't know if you're familiar with the Zoom platform or not, and I know some of you are maybe listening through your browser, which is great. That's sort of how it's supposed to work. But if you are wanting to ask a question at all, at the end, I'll sort of stop my recording of this program, this session, if you will, and there's a feature called Raise Your Hand. I don't know if you've seen that or if we've explored that, but what I'll do is then I will open up the microphone if you want to ask a question, or certainly you can chat a question to me. But we'll proceed like this, and then at the very end, we'll open it up for some questions and answers. So with that as my introduction, again, thank you so much for joining us tonight for this opening session. So when we talk about the Bible and learning the Bible in context, we want to, through this entire session, as well as maybe an overview of what we're going to do throughout this entire course, is that we're going to, of course, after our introductory session tonight, our next session will be at the end of September, and we're going to focus on the geography and the layout of the land of Israel. We're also going to probably spend 2, if not 3 sessions on biblical archaeology. We're also going to highlight the customs and culture of the Bible. We are also going to focus on maybe a couple sessions on the life and ministry of Jesus, in particular, the Hebraic background of Jesus. And then we're going to conclude the class with sharing a few biblical stories that come to life on site of real biblical authentic sites. Although during the course of this seminar, we're going to, of course, visit a lot of sites along the way, but we'll sort of slow down at the end, if you will, and open our Bibles and look at the text and look at where some of these stories took place. Now, you may wonder why I use this particular term called the playing board of the Bible. Why use this concept? Well, here is the land of Israel. This land of Israel, we'll talk about its size and its width. Of course, we're going to talk about topography, geology, geography, history, archaeology, all the stories that took place here. We refer to this as the playing board of the Bible. Now, this concept may seem a little different for you, but let me illustrate by taking you to, I'm guessing, a few of the games that you have played as you were a kid. Maybe you still play these games with your kids or grandkids. Well, of course, we know these 2 games. And I think the first thing that we have to learn in order to play any really playing board game is we have to know how the board is oriented. For instance, how difficult and challenging would it be if we were to sit down with someone and we were asked to play a game of, I guess this is a 3-person chessboard? We would have to know how the playing board is oriented. I think we can agree that that might be a good first strategy. So what we do in approaching the Bible is that we view this as the playing board of the Bible. Now, not all the stories of the Old and certainly the New Testament take place or took place on this land we call Israel, but many of the stories took place. So we're very interested to learn not only where they took place in the north and the south, along the hill country of Judah near Jerusalem. Some stories even took place on this eastern side of the land of Israel today. But we want to approach this as if this is the playing board of the Bible. And we're going to learn the playing board through these disciplines that, as I mentioned before, historical geography. We're going to use biblical archaeology, customs and culture of the Bible, and those kinds of things. So let's talk about and introduce some of these disciplines as we anticipate sharing these in more detail as the class or this seminar proceeds. Now, on this left slide, you can see a satellite view of the region of Israel. In fact, over on this west side of Israel, we see the Nile River, which means this is Egypt. In fact, all of the Sinai Desert today is in Egypt. However, on this south, or the east side, I should say, of this right or eastern fork of the Red Sea, we call this the Gulf of Aqaba. Down here and to the east, if you're following my arrow, is all the western side of Saudi Arabia. However, just to the north of this border and to the east of the Jordan Valley is all Jordan, the country of Jordan. However, to the north, we have Lebanon and we have Syria to the northeast. Maybe that's better highlighted here on this right map where we see the topography of the land. And of course, now we can sort of zero in on the length of the land. From the south end of this map, the Red Sea begins. This is the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba. And the length of Israel today runs about 300 miles all the way up to the northern border, as I mentioned, with Lebanon to the north and Syria to the northeast. That means to the east of Israel is Jordan. This is the Sinai Desert and Egypt. So when we talk about this land, here's another satellite, if you will, of the whole region of Israel, including all the deserts of Jordan and Saudi Arabia down here, and eventually the Syrian deserts. And we would eventually get to Iraq up here as well. But this is the land of Israel. It's about 300 miles long, and at its widest point from the Mediterranean Sea to the west to the Dead Sea area. About here is the widest point, and it's about 75 miles in width. There is that widest point in the area that we call the biblical Negev. So we want to do our best to introduce this land to you and learn the best we can about how the land is oriented. This is a great angle shot as well of the whole Sinai Desert. And again, as I mentioned, Saudi Arabia, and a lot of people aren't aware that Saudi Arabia is so close to not only Jordan, but here in Israel at the Red Sea port of Eilat. So all of this down here to the south and east of the Gulf of Aqaba, that's all Saudi Arabia. Let's take another angle of the playing board. Now, this is another angle from the east. That means all this is Jordan. Here's that Jordan River that flows between the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee. We'll talk more specifically about these bodies of water. Of course, the Mediterranean Sea on the west that borders the land. In fact, this westerly view gives us that perspective. The Mediterranean coastline, the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, and that's the land. That's the playing board. So however we turn the map, if you will, this topography map that we like to use all the time in our teaching, this is essentially where many of the stories of the Bible took place. Now, if we pull back a little, to a wider perspective, this red circle, of course, illustrates how small, really, how small the land of Israel is in relationship to not only Egypt and Saudi and Jordan and in Lebanon and Syria, but look at this map. This is the ancient Near East map, and we can see all these regions. Today, this is the area of modern Turkey. However, in biblical days, all of this was the area of Mesopotamia. Abraham came here. Came from here, I should say, but Israel's just really a speck on the wider map of the region of the ancient Near East. Again, Israel bordering the Mediterranean Sea, but we can take a look at all the topography that's around this land. In fact, we like this term called the land between. Israel is really the land between everything to the north and east, and of course to the south and west, representing ancient Egypt. This particular map illustrates some of those people groups and regions that are, of course, mentioned in the Bible. In fact, these titles, we are perhaps familiar with these titles. The land of Canaan, the Hittites and the Mitanni lived up here to the north, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, eventually the Persians. All of these people groups ended up coming down through this land of Canaan or Israel at some point in biblical history. The Egyptians did the same thing. They pulled north and tried to control this region for strategic purposes. So caught in the middle, my friends, is this land of Israel. In fact, let's highlight it one more time again, because much of the biblical narrative takes place within this region of the larger playing board of Israel. Now, perhaps some of you may be already knowledgeable about the topography and the elevations of the land of Israel. Let's start with the Mediterranean Sea. I like this cutout offered to us by the IGM resources. Here in the heart of the country that runs from the south to about this region is the hill country of Judah. Now, if we take the Mediterranean Sea, being, of course, sea level, let's take Jerusalem right here. It's about 3,000 feet in elevation. However, just about 18 miles to the east is the Dead Sea, which is the lowest place on earth. It is close to 1,400 feet below sea level. In fact, even 75 miles north through the Jordan Valley is another body of water called the Sea of Galilee. That's also below sea level, about 680 feet below sea level. But just 35 or 40 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, at the very northern edge of what we call the Golan Heights today, is this white snow-capped mountain. Now, I'm just wondering, maybe at the end I can see how you would answer this, but how many of you knew that Israel had a snow-capped mountain about 5 or 6 or 7 months a year? That's quite amazing. And the peak of that mountain is actually owned, quote unquote, owned or controlled by 3 countries. Syria has the highest peak at 9,200 feet above sea level. Now, if my math is right, my friends, we go from the Sea of Galilee, 680 feet below sea level, to about 40 miles or so, roughly, to 9,200 feet. That's an elevation gain of about 10,000 feet just within 40-mile range. That's quite amazing to me. Israel owns the second highest peak at 7,300 feet, and Lebanon also owns or controls the lowest peaks of this mountain called Mount Hermon. It's mentioned actually in Psalm 133. So we're going to talk about geography in our opening session at the end of this month, September. Let me introduce biblical archaeology. We can take a look at what Jericho looked like, for instance. The slide on the left really represents how small the site was, about 13 acres. That's about it. And yet this was one of 31 cities that would eventually be taken by Joshua as recorded in the conquered list of Joshua 12. We're going to talk about what biblical cities look like. Here's Jericho. Here's another site. In fact, I just had the chance to excavate here this past July, helping the team of archaeologists dig at a site called Libnah. Notice that it's on a hill, and there are ruins now being displayed or uncovered, same as Jericho. Well, this whole idea of archaeology, it's really hard work. And my friends, let me tell you, it is not glamorous. It is not hunting for the Ark of the Covenant with Indiana Jones. Archaeology today is not hunting and finding this Ark of the Covenant. However, it's a lot of hard work in uncovering the structures, pottery, and artifacts from the days of the Bible. Let me show you this brief video of what a biblical site looks like, and we give credit here to our friends at SourceFlick for this video. Again, once again, let me share with you that this video may appear a little choppy to you, so I'll do my best to illustrate. Here is the site of biblical Gezer. Notice that it begins as a hill, but this site is developed as a hilltop site, valleys all around it. Here's the city of Samaria. Notice that archaeologists have uncovered many of the structures here at this ancient site, mentioned many times in the Bible. Or how about this particular site of Lachish? This was a city that was really attacked and devastated by the Assyrians and later on the Babylonians. In fact, Isaiah 36 mentions this. Here's the city of Gath, where the giant called Goliath comes from. This site is 130 acres, a big, large site where the Philistines had one of 5 cities. Or how about this particular city called Jericho? There's one wall and another wall. This was a 2-wall city, the first one conquered by Joshua. The Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle rested here at Shiloh, probably right there, for about 305 years. Hatzor, it's mentioned in Joshua 11. The archaeological ruins of this Canaanite and Israelite city. It's the largest site in Israel, 200 acres. However, look at this small site called Shechem, in between the modern buildings of this Arab city in the Samaritan Hill Country. And then finally, Jerusalem, where it's mentioned over 800 times in the Bible. And of course, everywhere you go in Jerusalem, you find something of antiquity. So if a biblical site, something we call a tell, is a city, generally speaking, built at least initially on a hill, this is a good model perhaps of what a site looks like. All these particular ruins at various levels of stratification. If we were to dig from the top to the bottom, we would expose these layers. And all these layers, if we were to take this piece of cake, all these layers represent occupation levels or time periods. Could you imagine, although this cake looks just too good to eat, right? But an archaeological site isn't this attractive, nor is it that tasty. But think of an archaeological site of having layers like this layered cake does. Each of these layers represent a particular time period in history. Take this model from Megiddo. Again, this is the archaeological tell. It's built on a hill, but notice that there are ruins down below, here exposed, as well as here in this area of the trench of the site, and even below these white structures that represent a whole different time period. Now, these lower levels represent a time period that we call early Bronze or early Canaanite. So these layers of structures date to an earlier time period than the ones on top, and that makes sense. The white structures are primarily all Israelite, beginning with a gate over here built by Solomon. We sort of know that because of the text of 1 Kings chapter 9. It gives us a hint that Solomon refortified this city. So just to understand that archaeology works this way, it's basically a whole site of one level after another. Here is that biblical site called Megiddo, by the way, strategically located in what we're going to learn next in our next session. It's called the Jezreel Valley. In fact, lots of biblical history took place here in and around the Jezreel Valley. But here is that biblical site so that you sort of get a good handle on what sites look like today. In fact, let's fly over this particular site. And again, my apologies for maybe the choppiness of this video. But here is the site of Megiddo. Just a short couple-minute drone video that we shot on location a couple months ago. You can see some of the excavations of this site. The first primary excavation took place in the 1920s by the University of Chicago, but over in the distance are hills, the Hill of Moreh, Gilboa, Mount Tabor. All have biblical connections of one kind or another. Here's the famous water system of Megiddo. We'll talk about that in our biblical archaeological session. But when we take a look at this site, we can see all these levels of occupation now being exposed. In fact, this site has, as you saw on the screen, about 25 levels of occupation that span about 2,500 years. So we find lots of gate structures. In fact, here's a gate structure here and here. We find other palace and horse stable and storehouse structures. Here we're zeroing in on a Canaanite gate here at the bottom of the video, and a gate here probably built by Solomon that dates to the end of the 10th century BC. All of these ruins represent some historical period in biblical history. So it's an amazing experience to go to sites like this and to see really the Bible unfold in 3D color, if you will, as we understand that Megiddo also was a very strategically important and located city, I should say, with guarding this particular pass into the Jezreel Valley. We'll talk about more of those dynamics in our next session at the end of September. So we will see a lot of sites in this course, in this seminar. This particular site of Capernaum, we see first century ruins, but built on the first century ruins is a 5th century synagogue. Capernaum is mentioned in the Gospels, so we will certainly touch very closely the life and ministry of Jesus. Here at Magdala, this is a 1st century synagogue found at Magdala, and look how modest it is. And even though Magdala is only really mentioned once in the Gospels, we have to think that Jesus probably taught from this synagogue when he was here. And Don't forget that a particular woman named Mary Magdalene was from this city as well. So lots of sites, lots of biblical connections, lots of ancient ruins like the ruins at Beit Shan. Could you imagine walking down this colonnaded Roman street? The bathhouses were over here, the theater to the right, and the Old Testament tell of Beit Shan in the distance there. This site has been extensively excavated. So we'll visit and talk about gate structures and fortifications like this one at Gezer. This is a stone gate structure. The entrance into the city would have been here. You would have walked in and through this gate, and on the left would have been 3 chambers, and on the right, 3 chambers. And this is a typical format or size of a gate structure that have been found in many biblical sites throughout Israel. We'll even walk through something that's mentioned in 2 Kings 20, 2 Chronicles 32, something called Hezekiah's Tunnel. This is a water tunnel built by King Hezekiah, probably a project beginning in 705 BC. So we're going to literally touch and learn about even how Hezekiah's tunnel was cut out of rock. This inscription that was found at the end of the 19th century tells us that 2 teams of rock cutters actually were part of cutting out of that particular water tunnel. Just to the south of where that water tunnel exits, if you will, is the real pool of Siloam. So some Old Testament ruins, some New Testament ruins. And if we recall from John 9, this is where Jesus sends the man born blind, and he is sent here to wash in this pool of Siloam. So real sites connecting to real biblical narratives. We'll also probably spend some time in the Israeli Museum, and we'll see artifacts like this Israelite 4-horned altar found at Beersheba, or this inscription. If you look closely at the second line here, you can see the name Pilatus. Now, that may ring a bell in reference to what the gospel writers mention, a particular man who was in Jerusalem at the time of Jesus' passion, his last week. This is the name of Pontius Pilate. This inscription was found in 1962, upside down in secondary use in the theater there. So we find secondary inscriptions, or should I say a primary source, but secondary inscriptions that support and confirm the biblical text, the primary text of the Bible. That's quite amazing and impressive. In fact, here in this theater is where that inscription was found. Caesarea, we could just spend 10 minutes on this one slide because we can place guys like Paul and Peter and Philip and Cornelius all here in this city that was actually built by King Herod the Great beginning in 22 BC. So we are so interested in learning about archaeology. In fact, this particular cave, one of 12 at, I think, the most significant site in all of Israel. It's a site called Qumran. It's where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. So we pay attention to texts like this, in particular, this text of Isaiah that was found at that site. And if we return to Jericho, we'll talk specifically about the ruins of Jericho and how they indeed confirm the historicity of the text of Joshua chapter 6. But notice its proximity, its location in the Jordan Valley, right on the edge of the Judean desert. So we'll pay attention to not only biblical sites and archaeology. In fact, here's that retaining wall most likely Joshua saw this very wall when he attacked the city. But we also, as I was saying, we pay attention to the locations and the proximities of these sites in relationship to the regions of the Bible. So lots of sites. If we go to Jerusalem, in fact, here in this area called the Ophel, it's quite impressive that Ilat Mazar, one of the archaeologists here, actually found an inscription on a seal. It's a seal impression with the name Hezekiah, written in an early form of Hebrew. It dates to the end of the 8th century. So again, as you know, the name Hezekiah, it links us, it connects us to the Bible. It's sort of interesting to also know that in 1986, an ancient boat was found like this on the shoreline of the Sea of Galilee. Now, this should really intrigue us, my friends, because when we take a look at what the boat now looks like, completely restored, think of the text of Mark 4, for instance, or Matthew 14, the two storm narratives where in one story, Jesus is in the boat and the disciples encounter this storm. And the disciples wake Jesus up, if you recall, and they say, Jesus, don't you care if we drown? And of course, Jesus gets up and says, peace, be still. But in that other story of Matthew 14, Jesus comes walking on the water towards the disciples, who are no doubt in a boat similar to this one. So this is quite interesting. What brings us this kind of investigation, or this kind of revelation of archaeological ruins like this, really provides context to some of the more familiar stories of the Bible. Thirdly, we're going to talk about, maybe over the course of a couple sessions, some of the customs and culture of the Bible. We'll talk about burial customs and religious practices. Here's a figurine of the Phoenician god of rain and thunder. We know him from 1 Kings chapter 17, or 18, I should say. His name is Baal, or Baal, the Phoenician god of rain and thunder. So knowing what these figures look like, knowing what gate structures look like. Incidentally, this is another chamber gate that we can see at a site called Khirbet Keyafa. In fact, in the background of this is, I would think we could call it a very famous valley. It's mentioned in 1 Samuel 17. It's called the Valley of Elah. And that's precisely where David fought Goliath. So this gate and this fortified city was located right along this valley. In fact, right there, if you can see my pointer, is another essentially unexcavated site called Soko, which helps us, using the text of 1 Samuel 17, maybe even identify where the battle between David and Goliath took place. Most likely it was in this area of the valley here. But we pay attention to things like gates. In fact, this particular model of the city of Lachish represents a double-walled city. So when we open our Bibles to Isaiah 36, for instance, and we know that the Assyrian king Sennacherib surrounded this city, as well as 45 other cities, we sort of know how people lived. In fact, this is a battle relief left to us by Sennacherib. You can see the Assyrians with their big battering rams charging up their siege ramp, with the Judeans trying to defend the city as they position themselves on this fortification tower. So some of these details really offer us lots of insights so that we can understand and appreciate the biblical text even more. Culture and context also includes paying attention to agriculture. We'll talk about the first fruits. We'll talk about wheat. In fact, back in the days, not too long ago in Israel, wheat was thrown up in the air, and the separation between the wheat and the chaff took place this way. I have to think that this really represents how it may have taken place in biblical times. In fact, at Megiddo, a grain bin was found dating to the 9th century BC. In fact, in this grain bin, an inscription was found, and his name in Hebrew is Shema, the servant of Jeroboam. Maybe the word Jeroboam rings a bell in your mind. He was one king of the north, the northern kingdom of Israel, but Shema was a servant. This is a name that appears in the biblical text. So it's so interesting to find and talk about inscriptions that connect us again to the Bible. How about this? If you were harvesting your grapes, you would crush your grapes in this area. So when you talk about the making of wine, again, a cultural element in Israel, that's how it took place. Pomegranates still grow today. But pomegranates, actually, the shape of one was actually represented in this archaeological discovery in the shape of a bell. In fact, the use of a bell, I should say, in the shape of the pomegranate, but here a bell like this was actually attached to the hem of the high priest, and this was found in the drainage channel in Jerusalem, an archaeological discovery of just a few years ago. So here we have a pomegranate, and this bell takes the shape of that particular fruit. Olives are all over the place in Israel today. So an olive press look like this. Shepherd life. We'll talk about shepherds as well. That whole motif appears in the Bible. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. John chapter 10. Of course, Jesus identifies himself as the good shepherd. Part of customs and culture will also be to talk about how people lived. What kinds of houses did they live in? This is a typical, what is called a four-room Israelite house. And we find them at various Israelite sites in Israel. These four people are standing in the four parts of this ancient structure. Let me also introduce to you the Hebraic background of Jesus. We'll probably spend maybe 2 sessions talking about Jesus in terms of where he served, primarily in the Sea of Galilee area to the north, but also through the Decapolis, through the area of Perea, as mentioned in the book of John, and of course in Jerusalem right here. But we'll try to retrace the footsteps of Jesus and talk about where he served, how he taught, what he taught, and even how he taught and served people with the kingdom message. Capernaum was the main ministry base area, if you will, in the north, in the Galilee area. So let's fly over this site and take a look at this region of Capernaum, located on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum was a very prominent city. The ancient road would have passed not only by, but literally through this city that you can see here right on the coast line of the Sea of Galilee. So if we fly over this site, we can connect to the life of Jesus through the gospel narratives. This 5th century synagogue that you can see in white was built over a 1st century synagogue, as well as 1st century ruins all around the site. Now, this site has been excavated a long time ago by our Catholic archaeologist fathers, and others as well, but we can place Jesus here. For instance, Mark 1, he teaches in the synagogue, not this one, but the one below it at the lower level. Mark 2, in a house here, a lame man is lowered down to Jesus in one of these house structures. Luke 7, John 6, Mark 9. All of these stories actually took place here in a real site where Jesus served so many. And let's also remember that it was most likely along the shoreline of this city where Jesus called at least 5 disciples. 4 of them would be fishermen: Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and also a tax collector named Levi or Matthew lived here. So we pay attention to locations and historical narratives and where these stories took place. Here is one example where we can actually pinpoint it taking place at Capernaum. Now, some historians and archaeologists, they conjecture that maybe Capernaum looked like this. In fact, others have identified at least 18 ancient harbors along the coastline of the Sea of Galilee, so maybe Capernaum looked like this. And that helps us to try to picture Jesus living here and serving here. We return to this very modest synagogue at Magdala as well. Look how small it is. Maybe 50 or 60 people at best. Jesus most likely would have taught right here in this area. In fact, this platform with very Jewish symbols on it most likely was where the scroll was positioned. Here's another 1st century synagogue, not mentioned in the gospel text. It's called Gamla, but again, a little larger, but still quite modest for synagogues. Can you picture Jesus standing here and teaching about the kingdom? Matthew chapter 9 tells us that Jesus taught in many of the synagogues of the region. In fact, that one time in Luke 4, when he actually appears in the synagogue in Nazareth, his hometown, I find it very interesting that the scroll of Isaiah is handed to him. And this highlighted section of the scroll of Isaiah was what Jesus read on that day. Thanks to Bible Places and Todd Boland for sharing this great picture of the Dead Sea Scroll of Isaiah found in 1947. But it's interesting for us to be able to know what a biblical text looked like. So when Jesus stands there in the synagogue and reads from the text of Isaiah, this is what he would have read from, a text that looks like this. Now, Jesus went to Jerusalem. So we talk about the size of Jerusalem, and we'll also spend a few sessions talking about Old and New Testament Jerusalem, including Jesus in the temple courts of Jerusalem. Thanks to Dr. Dan Warner, an archaeologist, he presents a great model of Jerusalem and how it looked in the days of Jesus. Now, today, the city of Jerusalem, defined by the old city walls, and I'm retracing them now, and if you're following my arrow, you're observing that these walls continue all the way around about 2.8 miles. These are not really ancient walls at all, relatively speaking. They only date to about 482 years old. They were built by the Ottoman Empire, or a specific Ottoman emperor called Suleiman the Great. They were built in 1537 AD. But just pay attention to the details of this picture. Not only the old city, about 35,000 people live in the old city today, but the Temple Mount, but also to the east of the Temple Mount is a valley called the Kidron. And on the east side, or the far side of this valley, is the Mount of Olives. And even farther east is the city of Bethany and Bethpage. And you can even see the Judean desert in the far distance. So I think this picture really sums up some of the topography of the hill country of Judah, including a view of the desert of Judah to the east. So, but getting back to the life and ministry of Jesus, we're going to talk about Torah as the way of life. We're going to talk a little about rabbinical systems, how Jesus taught in terms of the way he taught. We're going to talk about parables, or mashal, and a particular genre of language that Jesus used called remez. And of course, we'll remember his kingdom focus. So I hope that this session or two will really bring to life the culture of Jesus. Remember in Luke 8, a woman who had an issue of bleeding actually tries to touch the hem of the garment of Jesus. I just love this picture that's actually taken from the chapel area at Magdala. They did a great job in representing what maybe a prayer shawl looked like, or a garment, and that whole narrative where the woman wants so desperately to touch the hem of Jesus' garment so that she would be healed. But let's remember that Jesus taught about the kingdom. In fact, when we talk about Luke talking about Jesus teaching about the kingdom in the plain, maybe the plains of Gennesaret, Matthew actually records Jesus speaking about the kingdom on this, perhaps it's this very hill called the Mount of Beatitudes. But the kingdom message was certainly Jesus' go-to message. And then finally, as we conclude this introductory session, we'll try to tie together some biblical stories and bring them to life the best we can. So we'll go to a place like En-Gedi, and we'll open up our Bibles to 1 Samuel 24, and we'll talk about David hiding from King Saul here in one of the caves of the canyon of En-Gedi. Notice that it still flows with water all year round. This is why David was here, simply because it was a source of water. In fact, let's try to fly over this site as well as we use our drone footage and appreciate some of the topography of this region of the Bible. Right on the edge of the Judean desert, En-Gedi served as an oasis for so many people. In fact, some of the earlier ruins, the earliest ruins of this site, go back to about 3,500 years, or excuse me, 3,500 BC, even 4,000 BC, or close to 6,000 years ago. Really early on, when Israel was a country occupied by people. But notice that this particular canyon, it's green. It's because water flows here. So while there is not really too much archaeological ruins here, although there are some, we really pay attention to the biblical narratives like Song of Song, chapter 1, 2 Chronicles 20, but also this 1 Samuel 24 passage that places David somewhere here at En-Gedi. On every trip that we lead, of course, this is a favorite place for many. We enjoy getting wet here. It's usually rather hot, most of the time sunny. So we enjoy getting wet here, just maybe the same way that David back 3,000 years ago did himself. So a beautiful place called En-Gedi. So as we move on, we'll also talk about getting wet. How about that, my friends? Here's a good friend in our last trip this past June. He really enjoyed getting wet here at En-Gedi. Of course, we'll revisit Jericho and we'll talk about the walls of Jericho. We'll talk about the mud brick wall that was positioned on top of this stone revetment wall or retaining wall. Let me go back to this slide if I can. Can you picture a mud brick wall about 10 or 12 feet high positioned on top of this stone wall? So we'll talk more in detail about the archaeological evidence that supports the Joshua 6 story as it took place here in this Canaanite city. Caesarea, this is another particular great aerial photo of the theater, the palace of Herod. He even had a freshwater swimming pool. There was even a hippodrome where horses were raced. And then a huge harbor out here in the Mediterranean coastline. The Apostle Paul himself used this harbor. In fact, on the way back from his second and third missionary journey, the biblical text in Acts tells us that he sails into this city of Caesarea, and then later in Acts 26 and 7, he sails out of this same harbor on his way to Rome. So again, many biblical connections, and one more here, the Elah Valley where David fought Goliath. Probably in this narrow part of the valley is where David, armed with God's strength and confidence, defeated the Philistine giant. We'll walk the streets of Jerusalem. We'll connect with Jesus walking on this very Herodian street. We'll talk about the Judean desert as well, where the prophet Isaiah perhaps echoed the very famous words that are recorded in chapter 40. Prepare the way for the Lord, make straight a highway for our God. Incidentally, John the Baptist would, in the same desert, echo the same words of Isaiah in preparation for Jesus, who would come, be born in Bethlehem, would serve the people, and then ultimately give his life for you and me. He would die on the cross and in 3 days be raised again. This is the garden tomb, probably not the authentic tomb of Jesus, but yet it's a reminder of the hope that we all find in Christ. So as we talk about these biblical connections that we can make, I'm so thrilled and honored to guide us through these upcoming sessions that will, I hope, in my heart, help you understand the Bible in the context of this playing board of Israel. Just take a note here of our next class. It will be on Thursday, September 26th, and we're going to shoot for the same 8:30 p.m. Eastern time zone slot here so that we can maximize people on the West Coast who join us for an evening of teaching. These sessions will probably again be in the 45, 55, maybe an hour range at most. But we hope that you're able to join us for these sessions. And once again, the next one, or session one, technically, historical geography, will take place on the 26th of September at 8:30 p.m. So before I unshare my screen and maybe take a few questions from you, again, it's been my pleasure to have you join us for this introductory session, and I really do hope that you're able to join us. We're going to try to also place the video or the recording of this online, and you can look for that on our website, biblical.israeltours.com. So thanks again for joining us, and we hope that you've enjoyed this first session together. Shalom, shalom.